Hello, Mark Kleiman.
Hello, Glenn Loury. How are you?
I'm excellent, thanks. Not at all bad. We should introduce ourselves. I'm Glenn Loury, economics professor at Brown University.
Mark Kleiman. I teach public policy at UCLA.
Mark, it's a pleasure to be talking to you on bloggingheads.tv. Long overdue.
It is. This is only my second venture.
Oh, really? But
yes,
you're a big blogger. I've somehow gotten the impression that you are a presence in the blogosphere.
A mild one, but it's taken a while to get the blogging heads thing going. And I did one with Megan McArdle, which she and I both loved, and the blogging heads folks said, no, not enough argument.
Oh, yeah, well, we do have to disagree. This is very important.
I understand. I understand the rules. I understand. Yeah. It's hard for me to disagree with you, Glenn, but I'll work at it.
I don't know if I believe that, Mark, but it was nice of you to say so. Well, here's one thing I think we can disagree about right off the bat, which is who should be the Democratic nominee this year. As you know, I've, on the previous Blogging Heads, admitted in public my support for Hillary. Rodham Clinton has caused me no end of pain, especially amongst my racial brethren. But you think that's the wrong choice?
I do think it's the wrong choice, both in terms of who's likely to win in November, and equally important, since I think either of them probably would win, who's likely to bring in more senators and representatives, because I think the effectiveness of the next president is going to depend crucially on whether we're working with 52 seats in the Senate or 58 seats in the Senate.
I'm sorry, Clinton has shorter coattails than Obama and less electability. Is that the...
the opposite of coattails, I think. I mean, imagine you're
she'll hurt other people running with her on the Democratic ticket.
I think that's true. I think particularly in red states and red districts. All the opponent has to do is point at you and say, you say you're a moderate, you say you have Western state values, but you're supporting Hillary Rodham Clinton for president.
And they won't be able to say that about Barack Obama, you're quite sure. Yeah, they won't be able to take anybody who is a relatively liberal Democrat and say just about the same thing about them.
I don't think so. Now, of course, I can't be sure. But it seems to me that in lots of ways, Obama is less vulnerable to that. In particular, in lots of ways, he's culturally more red state compatible than Clinton is.
How so?
Yes, she grew up in Illinois and lived in Arkansas for a long time.
But he knows his way around a black church? Is that your point?
No, she's recognizably a bicoastal and he's recognizably a Kansan in lots of ways. Yeah, I think the church stuff actually helps. I mean, not just that he knows the way around the church, he knows the way around the Bible. And I think that can be quite disarming. If you think that voters voted for Ronald Reagan because they really wanted the rich to get richer, then liberalism is just, death. But if you think they voted for Ronald Reagan because they were afraid or they disliked the prospect of being ruled by people who, in their view, had contempt for themselves and their lifestyle and their beliefs, then it seems to me Hillary Clinton's a much bigger threat to them emotionally than Barack Obama.
I think that's a canard. I really do. Hillary Clinton has contempt for the beliefs of ordinary Americans in Missouri or Kansas or Nebraska, or they just think so?
I didn't say it was true. I said
I see. They just think so.
I think they think so, and
yeah,
and I think it is true that Barack Obama is in some ways culturally closer to them than she is, and as he says, less invested in the culture wars of the '60s, and I think that's part of what has drawn some hostility to him from the left. Even though it seems to me on lots of dimensions, he's actually the more liberal of the two candidates.
Yeah, I expect that's true. I've always had this feeling about his candidacy that there was a sort of stealth aspect to it. I mean, it reminds me of the way that George W. Bush communicated with the evangelicals kind of tacitly and indirectly, although he did a lot of explicit communicating with the evangelicals away, but kind of the winking and the kind of under the unspoken indication that I'm on your side, and I think that many people far to the left of the center of American politics have this sense about Barack Obama that he's on our side, notwithstanding the fact that he can't say so publicly because that would undermine his electoral credibility or something like that.
I understand it's read that way, and I see it almost the opposite. It seems to me he's been completely explicit about his goals. All he said is, I don't dislike conservatives. I don't completely contemn conservative ideas. Yes, I hear what you're saying. Here's what you're saying. Here's why I disagree with it. Let's reason together, but here's what I want to do.
Well,
I don't think.
I'm sorry, go on.
I mean, I think when he pursues a completely progressive agenda, the people who think of themselves as conservatives will not have any right to say, "Oh, we were betrayed, we were fooled." And I think lots of them will be okay with it. They want somebody ruling them that they think listens and hasn't already ruled out their ideas as primitive and unprogressive. And it seems to me that's right.
I'm surprised at you, Mark. Where's the ideological edge? I mean, the culture wars were worth fighting, no, and are not over. And the battle between Reaganomics and something that's more the opposite of Reaganomics, something that's more like Paul Krugmanomics. I'm not asking you to agree with Paul Krugman about everything, but you know what I'm saying. That's a big difference, no? The idea that taxes are the enemy, that the Second Amendment endows people with, some sacrosanct right to arm themselves, or that gays are a threat to the cultural integrity of America. These are all bad ideas that are vigorously opposed, no?
And Obama has said, on each one of those cases, Obama has said that those are bad ideas, and expressed strongly the other idea. In fact, I would hope if he were the nominee or the president to talk him out of some of his vigor on the gun issue, which I don't think is particularly well placed. But he hasn't waffled at all on the ideas. He's just been prepared to say, okay, yeah, I hear where you're coming from. Here's what you think. Here's the thing you fear. And here's the part of the thing you fear that I think you're right to fear, and here's what to do about it. What I said on my blog is that...
Yeah, go ahead.
That he is just as willing as Hillary Clinton to screw conservatives, if by conservatives you mean people who really liked the Reagan agenda. He's just prepared to kiss them first and tell them he loves them afterwards.
And these conservatives are going to be patsies enough to sit still for all of this and get rolling this way?
No, because, see, the problem, I think, with this whole analysis as it's played out in blogs and in the media, is that all of us chatterers assume that the voters, sometimes assume, that the voters think the same way we do. He's not fooling, and he's not intending to fool conservative politicians and conservative interest groups and conservative pressure groups. I mean, he's not trying to convince Grover Norquist that he's on his side. That's not going to work. He's not. He's against Grover Norquist and everything Norquist stands for. But there are tens of millions of people out there who have been voting Republican against their interests because of their cultural fear. And he's prepared to go to those people and say, there. It'll be all right. As St. Paul said to the Corinthians.
Yeah, I don't believe it not for a minute, Mark. I don't think it can work. They haven't even begun to define Barack Obama as the cultural threat that I think he's very susceptible to being defined as. I'm not saying he's a cultural threat.
Right.
This is not a problem for me. But it seems to me that that church on the south side of Chicago, that he's a staunch member of. My 50-year-old cousin drowned. He's a member of that church, and he drowned 2 years ago. And I was in Chicago, inside Jeremiah Wright's United Methodist, I believe that's what it's, Trinity, United Methodist Church out there on 95th Street on the south side of Chicago. I was in the church, because that's where the funeral was. It's an Afrocentric church. I mean, maybe that needs to be explained to people. I just mean that it's very heavily focused on a kind of black identity Christianity dynamic. Now, I'm not criticizing this. I don't want to be misunderstood. Jeremiah Wright is a pretty radical Christian pastor out there. And, I'll just cut this short. I just think there's a lot of grist for Carl Rovian Mill in the clash between the culture that plays on the south side of Chicago, where Louis Farrakhan is an important fixture. And again, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to paint Barack Obama with any negative brush. I'm just calling attention to facts.
Right. Obama's pretty quick on the Farrakhan front.
I'm sorry, say again?
When the Church magazine gave some sort of award to Farrakhan. Obama's
yes.
pretty quick to say, well, not leave me out. Look, I think the church is something of a vulnerability. I mean, there's some limit to how much the Rhodians can exploit that while they're still exploiting his secret commitment to Islam. But they'll do some of it. The problem is he just comes across
the hobgoblin of little minds.
He just comes across so nice and so genuine. And look, there's a certain reluctance, particularly in the elite culture, by which I include all of the political class.
Yeah.
Certain reluctance to be completely frank about racism, and I think that's going to be something of an insulator. The other thing that's a factor in play is that there are an awful lot of Americans who really have a strong need to prove to themselves that they're not racist. And Barack Obama gives them a very cheap way to do that.
Then they should adopt one of these parentless kids who
they're
are
not going to do
teeming
that.
in the foster care systems of the large cities of our country. If they want to prove they're not racist, do something. Don't go and cast a ballot for some guy who's vaguely not off-white.
No,
sorry about that again, but no slap at Barack Obama. I'm just saying some of this motivation to vote for a guy who's not white just leaves me cold, because it's the cheapest way you can possibly express your lack of racism.
I agree. It's if people who are not interested in doing it some expensive way, like adopting a black child, will do it the cheap way, and we'll have a president with 58% of the vote, strongly committed to a progressive agenda. Somebody said that, insofar as the race problem in this country is as much about culture as it is about skin color, I mean, Obama's the perfect finesse.
Yeah,
somebody said his bumper sticker ought to be Obama or a vote for the white hat.
It's all very interesting, and there's some subtle stuff going on. But here's the thing, I mean, and I even see it in the Democratic primaries, Barack Obama going around the country, blacks voting for him 70, 80, 90% in these various jurisdictions. He's not the black candidate, of course, but yet he is the black candidate, at least in the minds of lots of people.
You got 40% of the white vote in Georgia?
Pardon?
You got 40% of the white vote in Georgia?
The white Democratic vote in Georgia.
Yeah,
you can almost put all those people in one room.
That's true.
No, sorry, but Idaho, it's one room. In Georgia, it's going to be a hotel ballroom. But
right.
But I'm just saying, white Democrats in red states are hardly a random draw on the electorate of those states.
That's okay, so he's not going to carry Idaho. We all know that.
Right. Or Utah, or
yeah, right.
Probably Kansas for that matter.
No, he's not going to carry Kansas either. That would be a miracle.
But I was trying to get somewhere. I was trying to say that whereas within the Democratic primary contest, calling attention to the blackness of Barack Obama's support is a taboo, and when Bill Clinton pointed out the obvious fact that Barack Obama had prevailed in South Carolina in part because he was overwhelmingly supported by black voters, just as Jesse Jackson had been in earlier primaries, a ton of bricks fell on the Clinton campaign. Mm-hmm. The Republicans are not going to be encumbered in that way. And in fact, the ton of bricks that will come out when people start decrying the tacitly racist character of certain characterizations or associations that the Republican operatives are going to make, and their 501c3 or whatever it is, I don't remember,
527, right.
Thank you. Tax exempt, campaign things, will only help reinforce the message that they're trying to get across, they can then, campaigns can deny that they had anything to do with, or they can, chastise particular people who are off the reservation with respect to the, severity of their remarks, but the damage will already have been done. And, I worry about that.
No, look, I think all that's true. I don't know how it'll play out. What I do is, when I look at the polling data, Obama's now a relatively well-known commodity, not a very well-known commodity. He's got, the last poll I saw, he had 59% favorable and 30% unfavorable. And McCain was, 58-32 or something, about the same. And Hillary Rodham Clinton was 50-50. And that's just a very deep hole to start from. And I'm on a listserv of journalists and bloggers, and somebody offered the following proposition back: conditional on Obama's being nominated, this person was prepared to bet that his negatives would never get as high as Clinton's are today, and presumably they'd go higher too after 6 months of mud.
Well, all these things are
just
very
a
hard
bad
to predict, aren't they?
Hmm?
I said these things are very hard to predict, and the error in polling on the Democratic primary side that's been much discussed gives us all the more reason to think that in this particular candidacy, I'm talking about Obama's, we may, may be facing even greater difficulties in forecasting what people are going to do. The other
I think the errors in polling, and I mean, what's more striking to me than the errors in polling is the disparities in polling. I mean, you've got two polls run the same day. One of them showing the race almost even, the other one showing Hillary 20 points up. And I think the fact is that, again, outside the very sort of top of the political awareness spectrum, where there's strong passions on both sides, I think most Democratic voters are saying, gee, which of these two wonderful things do I want to choose? And they go back and forth every day.
Now, what about the gender factor, Mark? I'm also of the view that we haven't really seen evidence of the full potential, I should say. We haven't seen the full potential for the sympathy that Hillary Clinton will draw from female voters when they finally have an opportunity to cast their ballot for a woman for president. My sense is that benefit to her has been underestimated or understated in the discussion so far.
Well, where does that come from?
In a general election.
I mean, so that can mean several different things. It can mean more women who ordinarily vote Democratic will vote. Right, we'll get better turnout from Democratic voting women. Right. And I think there's probably some of that, though I think the turnout's going to be very high for Democrats this year. No matter
in any case, fair enough.
On the independent side, yeah, I mean, are there some soccer moms she'd get because they're interested in making that breakthrough? I'm sure there are. But when you look at least the Democratic primaries, he's been winning among independent voters. She's been winning the Democratic base, which I think we mostly have anyway. But I think the big thing on Obama's side, and this is what we just talked about, I think he demobilizes the opposition very substantially. I mean, the Republicans have a tough hand to play this year. They've got a candidate that many of the elite Republicans really dislike.
Yeah, I've heard this theory. Yeah,
and,
right. And the only person who can wake up these disgruntled conservatives would be Hillary Clinton as the nominee, and
she's the unity candidate for the Republicans.
Yeah.
And none of this is. I mean, all this is analysis I put on top of my underlying bias, which is that my desire to have a candidate who's eloquent, for once, is really overwhelming. I think there's probably some electoral advantage there, but it's partly merely a matter of taste.
Yeah, eloquence, speech making.
It's one of the talents of the president. And
I'd much more prefer policy expertise and a breadth of knowledge about the instrumentalities of policy making and of government. I don't know. I think speechifying can be overrated. No, I mean.
Well, it can be, but it can also be a very powerful tool. Ask FDR. Now, yes, FDR also had profound knowledge of the machinery of government, not particularly gained from Washington experience, right? He'd been Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy or something for a couple of years.
I find all these comparisons befuddling. Barack Obama, the experience card shouldn't be played. After all, if experience was an issue, JFK would have never been nominated, and he would never defeated Nixon in that 1960 election, et cetera, et cetera. And I look at Barack Obama, and again, due respect. And certainly this campaign is a phenomenon that needs to be reckoned with. But I just don't see it there. I don't see JFK. I don't see FDR. I don't see it. I see a kind of site onto which are being projected a lot of hopes and desires of a lot of people that something happened, but just in terms of the actual accomplishment, the record, the resume, the facts we have to go by, I don't see it. What am I missing?
Actually, do you know the blogger Hillzoy?
No.
Actually, if you like blogs, Obsidian Wings is among the best.
Okay.
And she had a very good wrap up of his record in it's Charles Peters in the Washington Post, the guy who runs the Washington Monthly. A very good wrap up of his record in Illinois, which is apparently pretty impressive. Did get stuff done across the aisle, and it wasn't Valentine's Day resolution stuff. Right? I mean, he got children's health insurance through. The most impressive thing to me, and he hasn't mentioned in the campaign, is the bill requiring that all police interrogations be videotaped, which, against the fierce opposition of the law enforcement community, he eventually got through unanimously. And as far as I know, Illinois is the only state in the country with that requirement. And right after Iowa, when the Clinton campaign was sort of thrashing around for bad things to say about Obama, one of their spokesmen said on background to reporters, well, his record of being soft on crime is going to be a problem for him. But that bill was about torture, and he was against it. I give him a lot of points for that. Well, no, unfortunately. And
still, we're far short of war and peace and tax policy and health.
Oh, sure. I mean, but I keep thinking about what Harry Truman said about Baruch. Baruch, always bragged that he was an advisor to presidents.
Yeah.
And Truman said, I don't know what you're so proud of. We get more advice than we can use. My take on Obama is that he's ferociously smart. I mean, I think he's probably smarter than Bill Clinton, who I think was probably the smartest president we've had since Jefferson.
How could you possibly know that, Mark?
Ferociously smart, and also seems to have his ego under control, so he's capable of taking advice. And he says things like, well, I don't want to surround myself with yes men and yes women, because people have to tell me when I'm wrong, because I'm not going to be right all the time. Now, okay, it's easy to say, but I get the sense that that's sincere. He doesn't have to be the smartest guy in the room, and he's prepared for somebody else to know more than he does. I think what you need in a president is not profound knowledge of how things work, either in terms of the ways the policies operate or the way they're made, but being a quick study and being able to pick out good advice from bourgeois. And I have to say, the quality of the Friends of Bill in the first Clinton administration, what may now become the first Clinton administration, doesn't really encourage me. Aside from the economic team, that was not an impressive group of people. And it's a
Bob Reich. You didn't like your colleague Bob Reich over at Labor?
Bob's a very smart guy. I don't think all that much happened at Labor. And, of course, as his book indicated, he was not really part of the inner circle. Labor's not the most important department. Where I do business is the Justice Department. And Janet Reno, who was Hillary Rodham Clinton's personal pick, she insisted, look, we've got to have a woman in one of the top 4 jobs, and you filled the other 3. So we're going to try Zoe Baird. No, we can't do that. Oh, we're going to try Kimber Wood. No, we can't do that. Oh, how about this state's attorney from Florida? The woman who, by the way, invented the ritual sexual abuse prosecution.
Okay, let's move on, Mark. I mean, I get it.
But we had 8 years of that, right? I mean, she was Attorney General for 8 years, and she was really, really, really bad at it, and nobody in the White House seemed to notice. So, I mean, the best claim the Clintons can make is, look, we've made all those mistakes once. We won't have to make them again, and Obama will. And then the question is, well, how much did they learn, and how is he smart enough to learn from somebody else's mistakes? Impossible to know. The one thing he said really, really bothered me. He said, it's not the president's job to manage the bureaucracies. Now, if he really believes that, then I'm with you. He's not going to be president.
Yeah, but it's all a piece with this sales pitch, right? It's all a piece with this the necessity, given his biography, to discount the relevance of on-the-ground experience in Washington and to, claim some higher ground. The president's supposed to inspire. President's, this is Ronald Reagan's mantra, right? The president's not a manager. He's not a micromanager. Jimmy Carter was a very smart fellow, micromanager, but he didn't lead the country. Ronald Reagan inspired Morning in America. Likewise, Obama needs to say, it's not about knowing what the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Treasury who has this desk has to do. It's about being able to set broad vision and articulate it so that people will fall in line.
Well, on those two examples, who got more done for his point of view about how the country should be run? Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan? I think it's an easy choice.
Ronald Reagan.
I mean, Reagan knew how to be president, even though he didn't know.
Yeah, but Ronald Reagan also had a movement.
Well, and that's...
he didn't get it done by himself. There was something called a conservative movement.
Right, and you're telling Obama's story. It's not about me, it's about a movement.
What I'm saying is that in the Democratic Party, that has something to do with, labor unions. It has something to do with building loyalty and a following over time, although I gather that's what he's engaged in. So I'm not really arguing with you, Mark. I want to move on, actually.
Okay.
Shall we?
Let's.
Okay. I had the distinct pleasure and a very interesting experience of introducing Angela Davis, who spoke here at Brown last night.
Wow.
She was the
There's a blast from the past.
Lecture. Yeah. Although she's still very much with us and still, she's still a radical critic. And she made an argument in part for the abolition of prisons. I thought of you.
I can imagine.
Having, reviewed some of your work of late on crime and punishment policy, I thought of you and I thought, what would Mark Kleiman say to this? What do you have? She says, we lack the imagination to think beyond the institutions that are at hand. We think the only way that we can be safe is by locking people up and throwing away the key, in effect. It wasn't directly a root causes argument, although there were root causes kinds of thoughts floating around there. Education should be improved, or, sort of health and welfare and the way we take care of poor people and so forth and so on. But it was saying prisons are horrible institutions, and compromising with the behemoth of a system, the so-called prison industrial complex, as she calls it, is not the way to go. Radical opposition is the only way.
Okay, but and on Monday morning,
on Monday morning, of course,
you got somebody who just murdered somebody. All right, now what? I mean, there does need to be an answer to that question. Now there are alternatives to prison for dealing with murderers, but most of us don't like those.
Most of the people in prison are not murderers.
No, they're actually an increasing fraction of the people in prison are people doing very long terms for violent crime. It's actually the violent crime fraction that's been rising along with the drug fraction over the last 20 years.
Still not the bulk of the people who are locked up. I said still not the bulk of the people who are locked up. My understanding is well over half of the people locked up are for nonviolent and drug offenses.
I think I think when you look at the numbers, it's about 40% violent, about 60% property and drug. Now, of course, that's the current offense. Right? One reason that people get long sentences for their drug offenses, the judge looks at their criminal history and sees some violent stuff. Okay, but you've got somebody who's, if the question is, should we abolish prisons? Right? Radical opposition. Okay, so now what are we going to do with somebody who's committed a really terrible crime? There are two good arguments for locking him up. One is to convince other people that, if you do that kind of thing, something bad happened. And the other is because we don't want to do it again, at least not to people outside prison. Right? How we get control of prisons is a different
and incapacitation. I was just saying deterrence and incapacitation.
Right. And if the question is, are we currently using our prison system well, I'd say no. And to some extent, I'd say what Davis said, which is that we lack the imagination to get beyond the notion that the only thing to do about crime is prison, and that we face a strict trade-off between the number of people we have in prison and the amount of crime we have. I think we ought to be looking for ways to have less crime and less incarceration. And I think there are such ways. But it doesn't get us to zero incarceration or anything like it. I think a reasonable goal would be to cut the number of prisoners in half over the next 10 years. And
that would be a radical transformation.
It would, and I think it's feasible. I say politically feasible, but operationally feasible to do that and have less crime at the end than we have now.
You should explain that to those of us who don't quite get it.
The main problem with the way we punish now is that we hand it out in chunks that are much too big. We're overweighted towards severity at the expense of swiftness and certainty in punishment. And all criminological theory and all behavioral economics tells us that if you want to discourage somebody from doing something, you have to do something about it right now. And actually, of course, anybody who's ever raised a child or trained a pet can tell you the same thing. A distant threat is not a useful threat. And a threat that something might happen is not a useful threat. You need a pretty good promise that something bad's going to happen right now. And that's relatively easy to deliver once somebody's been convicted and is either on probation, that is to say, didn't go to prison, or is on parole, that is to say, did go to prison, has now been let out early. In principle, we have the capacity to impose rules on those folks and to pretty quickly punish punish violations of those rules. But we don't, because those systems are overstaffed. There's an experiment running in Hawaii right now where a group of probationers who were repeatedly messing up on probation, and the normal thing was happening to them, their probation officer saying, "Look, don't do that again. Don't do that again. Look, you've got to stop doing that, or we're going to see the judge." And then eventually you see the judge, and the judge says either don't do that again or
revoke,
go to prison. So one judge, Steve Alm, said to the probation department, "Look, when we've got people who are repeatedly violating, I want to hear." Well, the first thing he said is, "Look, I want to hear about every violation the first time." And they explained, "No, that's not feasible. There are too many violations. You don't have that time, and we don't have that time." So he said, "Okay, let's take people who have repeatedly violated, but you haven't written them up for the court. Identify those people. And then I'm going to bring them in for a warning hearing. I'm going to say to them, okay, new sheriff in town, here are the rules. Anytime you violate one of the terms of your probation, you're going to be in jail that evening for a couple of days or a week, but right now."
Immediate short-term penalties being imposed for violations rather than letting the thing build up until you can only impose a very harsh penalty on the individual.
And of the first 150 people who got that warning, fewer than half ever had to be brought in for an actual sanction. The threat alone was sufficient. Now, these were people who had been repeatedly messing up on probation. Lots of them were methamphetamine users. Methamphetamine is a very hard problem to treat. And it turns out that lots of those people did, in fact, have voluntary control over their actions as soon as they figured out there was a real consequence. Most of the people who violated once didn't violate twice. And the comparison group, drawn from other judges, but pretty well matched sample, not a true experiment, but a good quasi-experiment, 37% of those people wound up doing prison time for probation violations over the course of those 2 years. And on the experimental side, it was about 1%.
That sounds encouraging. But I mean, I have a couple of questions. One is, we don't punish, as a matter of fact, as a result of some rational calculation about the cost-minimizing strategy for controlling crime. We punish, as a matter of fact, as a result of a complex social, cultural, and political process through which our laws are ultimately an expression of our fears and concerns and anxieties, and are the outcome of political gamesmanship between people who are competing for electoral support.
Mm-hmm.
So of what relevance would be a textbook observation that theoretically, assuming it's correct, that theoretically one could get as much deterrence bang for a lot less punishment buck if you did it differently? What does it matter if what's really going on is that people are consuming punishment as a aspect of their expression of deep cultural concerns or anxiety or antipathy toward certain elements of the population whom they may regard as unfit to be their fellow citizens or whatever it might be.
Well, then I'd say probably would.
Am I clear?
Yes, you are, and I might say, well, then what we really need is a really inspirational president to tell them otherwise.
Oh, come on.
No, actually,
you're kidding me.
No,
you mean to tell me you're alleging here that the election of this candidate, Barack Obama, who is the focal point of so many people's dreams and hopes and aspirations, unconnected with any concrete political program, that's somehow going to transform the politics of punishment that has been running amok in America since Richard Nixon was president?
No. I'm saying that electing somebody whose program is actually pretty well defined, if you want to look for it, though he does not recite it as a laundry list in his speeches.
Okay.
And who is eloquent, and who is persuasive, and who is culturally non-threatening, and who's not the great demon yet.
When he starts letting people out of jail, he's going to be culturally threatening.
No, but
when the Republicans find out that he might let somebody out of jail, they're going to trumpet it to everybody to make sure he doesn't get a chance to do it.
Arnold Schwarzenegger's about to let 30,000 people out of prison because he can't afford to keep them.
Either he or a federal court would do it, right?
Either he or a federal court would do it because he can't afford to keep them. And
right.
One of the things you can say is, look, since we have to let people out of prison, let's learn how to control them. Let's learn how to punish behavior and control behavior when we're not paying people's room and board bills. And the drug testing, is the part that's mostly going on in Hawaii. But this, being able to do position monitoring with either cell phone or GPS technology means you could let a relatively dangerous person out of prison and tell him where he's supposed to be 24 hours a day. Right? You're on a 10 p.m. curfew. Can't be out of your home between 10 p.m. and 8 a.m. And you've got to be at work when you're supposed to be at work, and you have to be at your anger management meeting when you're supposed to be there. And you can never be within 6 blocks of the street corner you used to deal on or the apartment the girlfriend you used to beat up. And, we could say that now, but we couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah, I hear you, Mark. And, there's the practical aspect, as you say, that something has to be done with bad actors and incorrigibles and people whose behavioral problems impose cost on others. On the other hand, as I hear you talk, and I'm for reducing the number of people in prison, as you know, and I'm certainly friendly to the ideas that you're throwing about. Nevertheless, I think the word Orwellian comes to mind. I think about the massive extent of control of soft or harder coercion and of tentacles of government state power into the lives of people. And I think, in some ways it's ironic, conservatives are always talking about liberty and they're always antagonistic to government.
Except
yet, what we're talking about here is electronic monitoring of the positions of hundreds of thousands of people as they move about in our society, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's just, it's a little chilling to contemplate.
Well, as an alternative to prison, it's not so bad.
Yeah. But I had another concern, which was that the sort of heavy behavioral reliance on certain behavioral presuppositions about people's responses to incentives. Now, I'm an economist. I believe people respond to incentives. And yet, I'm wondering, you say methamphetamine is as hard to control, and you really got people controlling their drug-taking behavior based on, the ability to threaten them with having to spend a weekend in jail or something like that? Do we, maybe the way I want to ask this question is this. What fraction of the crime problem do you think is susceptible to manipulation through the kinds of incentives, the benefit costs that are thrown up by punishment strategies, however clever those strategies may be designed?
I think the answer is a very large fraction. I don't.
Most crime is the outcome of rational
No.
decisions by people who, if they thought it wasn't worthwhile, would choose not to do
That
it.
doesn't follow at all. I know it can't possibly be the result of rational decisions, right? That's the fallacy of our current crime control mechanism. We've already made it that crime doesn't pay. Right? I mean, committing a residential burglary or selling crack on the street corner is just a dumb thing to do. I mean, even if your only alternative is collecting bottles to return them for deposit, it's really a low payoff activity. But the payoffs are in the present and the punishments are in the future. If you can move stuff closer, I would say to people making rational calculations. One of the people I talked to in Hawaii who's on this program, and the way it works is if you've got a drug problem and you're supposed to, that's one of the things they're trying to monitor. You get a color, right? You're purple, and there's a phone number, and you have to call the phone number after midnight every night or first thing in the morning. And there's a recorded voice that reads a list of colors. And if your color is there, you've got till 2 p.m. to show up for your drug test. And one of the people I talked to said, having to make that phone call every morning helps orient my head around not using that day.
Yeah.
Look, you can think about this as drug treatment, right? It's contingency management. There's lots of evidence. And again, when we talk about contingencies and incentives, it sounds as if we're talking language of economics, but we're not actually. I mean, there's a famous experiment with middle-class cocaine users, and they were randomized, and half the group got, drug testing, and sort of their drug test results were fed back to them and their family, so that was their incentive not to use. And the other half got all of that, plus every time they tested negative, every time they were clean, they got a coupon, and 10 coupons were good for a $25 gift certificate to the local sporting goods store. Now do the arithmetic. It's a trivial number compared even to the cost of the cocaine. Right? It can't possibly be motivating these people in any economic sense. And yet the recovery rate doubled because there was an immediate incentive.
That's not uninteresting. So, Mark, why is there no talk in this about what else can be done besides punishing or manipulating people's behavior through incentives to diminish the problem of crime? Why is there no talk about improving the quality of education, providing additional employment opportunities, opening up greater opportunities for integrated residential communities in big cities, things of this kind? Why is our the only arrow in our quiver when we talk about managing crime punishment?
Well, it shouldn't be the only one. I'm not convinced that the cost-effective other arrows are the ones you mentioned. If we can only fix crime by making fundamental social change, like reforming the schools, right? If we knew how to do that, then crime would be about number 6 on our list of reasons to do it. But if you ask the question, why don't we take 10% of what we now spend on the crime control machinery, police, courts, corrections, right? That's about $150 billion a year total, and move that money into public education. Well, public K through 12 education, last time I looked, was about a $500 billion enterprise. Not sure that's right. I think that's about right. So a 10% cut in law enforcement would allow a 3% expansion in the school budget. Now,
well, yeah, but if you're expanding uniformly across the entire system, that's true. But if you targeted those resources toward the places where education was most hard-pressed, you get a lot more leverage there. But anyway.
Right. What would I do to reduce crime other than punishment? Well, the best thing we ever did was take the lead out of gasoline. And there's still enough lead around, not just in Chinese toys.
This is cognitive development in early childhood, adverse effects of exposure to lead? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And it's big numbers.
How do you know that?
Well, we know it.
How do we know that?
We know it 2 different ways. One is you can actually study clinically the effect of lead, and it's not just cognitive. There's behavioral control stuff that's damaged by the heavy metals. And so you can do a study of kids from a neighborhood who are in juvenile facilities and kids from the same neighborhood who aren't. And you get different lead levels. So there's been pretty good causal evidence about lead and crime for a long time. Somebody just did a quite nice piece of econometrics looking at local level lead exposure and crime and claimed that you can explain something like 80% of the crime decline of the 90s. Now, of course, that's been explained 7 different ways.
We explained that by abortion, didn't we? We explained that by cops on the street, didn't we? I mean, what, is Stephen Levitt on the loose again? I mean, he's run out of...
Because this competes with his sped explanation. He doesn't like this one, but I'm convinced by those numbers. But the other thing is, we know that lead has big impacts on cognitive development, right? So you and I are both probably half a standard deviation worse off than we would have been had we been 30 years younger.
Boy, we'd have been really, really smart.
You would have been anyway. Again, we're talking big numbers.
Yeah, that's a big number, half a standard deviation.
And by the way, it is a contributor to the measured
racial difference.
Absolutely. So
let's talk about race and crime for a minute.
Just one more. I can't leave this without riding my favorite hobby horse. Nurse home visitation. It's got to be.
Oh yes, well no, that's one I like too. I used to write about that years ago.
And
whatever happened to that? There was this guy out in Colorado who was doing all these at the University of Colorado somewhere, who was doing all these evaluations of these careful longitudinal studies of nurse home visitation in like Rochester, New York, or Memphis, Tennessee. You know what I'm talking about?
There's the Syracuse study, right?
Yeah, maybe it's Syracuse, but But it was.
And then Howard Dean did it in all of Vermont, and we ought to be getting about to the point where you could see that in the juvenile crime statistics in Vermont. I don't know if anybody studied it, but my view is that those studies suggest, well, it's sort of cost effective if you do it for very poor, very at risk families, but not if you do it across the board. I think labeling families at risk before the kid is born is probably not such a smart idea. My proposal would be everybody gets a nurse home visit as part of routine prenatal care.
Yeah.
And then...
It would help if you had universal health care.
It would. But you wouldn't need that. I mean, you'd make that part of the city health department. But it's universal. Everybody gets...
If we vote for Hillary Rodham Clinton, we're more likely to get it.
I don't believe that. Don't believe that for a second. But in any case, we don't have to wait for universal health care. We can do this out of public health funds. Everybody gets a visit. And then the visitor decides whether to say, gee, you better worry about that sharp corner. Here's my phone number, goodbye. Or, how's next Friday for our next meeting?
Yeah.
Let the visitor touch it.
I agree. The stigma from pre-designating, the idea of universality, and then once you get your foot in the door, the capacity to exercise discretion about follow-on care and engagement. I like that. I like that very much. That's big government, though. But then I know you don't disagree.
Right. Exactly.
So, but on the race question, I read in some of your stuff where you're saying, and I of course agree, that the racial disparity in arrest and imprisonment with blacks much higher can't be accounted for by sort of conventional racist behavior, overt discrimination, convicting blacks in circumstances where whites wouldn't have been arrested or convicted, sentencing them longer for the same crimes and so on, but rather can be accounted for by other arguments that you would probably be better placed to explain than I. And I'd be interested in hearing from you about that and talking with you about that.
Well, the grim fact is that the basic other factor is higher crime rates, and you don't have to do that based on police reports. If you simply look at the racial identity of victims, and remember that almost all crime is intra-racial because it's mostly local. You're looking at very, very large differences, even once you control it for social class.
But just on that point, if I have a ghetto or a bad no-go district in the city, a district of high crime rate and personal violence and lots of social pathology and so forth and so on, And if I have a racial disproportion in the likelihood that people are going to be living in such districts, then I'm going to get and if living in such districts is associated with criminal participation for a variety of reasons that we could parse, then I'm going to get this racial disparity. But I could argue that the deeper cause of it is the fact of the segregated and racially and class segmented structure of the society in the first place.
And I entirely agree with that. And the consequence of that, if you add on one more factor, which is that if you look at all the studies, it's still true that punishment varies much more strongly by race of victim than by race of perpetrator, when there's a difference. And so the basic fact about growing up in one of those no-go neighborhoods is that you are surrounded by people that it's relatively safe to victimize. The burglary you commit on your neighbor, the assault you commit on your girlfriend, is simply not going to be punished as much as would be the case 5 miles, out in the suburbs. And so if you think there's any behavioral effect of punishment, then you've got a social trap. High crime leads to low punishment for crime leads to high crime. And we've landed in exactly the wrong spot on the sort of Laffer curve of incarceration. We're doing enough of it to generate lots of people in prison and not enough of it to actually turn off the behavior. And we're not providing equal protection of the laws to the people who live in those neighborhoods. So we were talking about things you could do to improve economic opportunity in the areas where lots of criminals come from. But the first thing I would put on that list is controlling crime. I mean, you can't understand the economic geography of any major U.S. city without thinking about crime. Everybody knows that poverty causes crime. I don't think it's nearly as well understood that crime is one of the things that sustains poverty. And so I think we're in a very bad social trap, and that's the reason that the prospect that you might be able to do less actual incarceration and still have less crime seems to me pretty exciting. And if the cost of that is doing some fairly intensive social control for people who aren't in prison, I think their neighbors would tell you that's a price well worth paying. But I think if we continue to just focus on the racial disparities of who's in prison and ignore the racial disparities of who's doing stuff that earns them a trip to prison, we're just not going to get the right piece of this puzzle.
You believe that with a change in the amount of enforcement, anti-crime enforcement in no-go zones of American cities, it would be possible to reduce the level of criminal offending there to levels that would be not dissimilar from what you see throughout the metropolitan areas? That's really within our technical grasp, if only we would ratchet up the level of law enforcement in these areas?
No. I think getting to a point where the crime rates there are the same as crime rates everywhere else is probably a bridge too far. And I don't think merely ratcheting up enforcement is the right thing to do. But in New York's cut its crime in half. And LA's almost there. And most of that reduction has been in the no-go neighborhoods. It can be done. And
New York has cut its crime in half. Well, okay, let's digress on that for a minute, because hasn't crime been trending down in most American cities? And weren't these claims that Rudy Giuliani was making about having, quote, cut crime rates in New York City, close quote, an effort, like most politicians do, to take credit for atmospherics that were going on more or less independent of any actions that he might have taken?
Far be it from me to pass up any chance to diss Rudy Giuliani. I mean, whatever you say about the primary process, at least it's spared us that. One of the world's most dangerous human beings. That said, the fact that he put Bill Bratton in to run the NYPD made a big difference. Yes, crime's down everywhere. Crime's down more in New York and more steadily in New York. Crime has gone down every quarter since Bill Bratton took over as Commissioner of Police in New York. And for a simple reason. I mean, this is a public management story, like most of this stuff. Bratton went on TV and said, we're going to reduce crime.
Sorry.
We're going to reduce crime, right? He made that a commitment. Now, all of us sophisticated types thought that was silly, right? Cops don't reduce crime. Cops deal with crime. Crime exists for other reasons that cops can't do much about. And Bratton refused to believe that and explained carefully to his precinct captains that if crime didn't go down in their precinct, he'd have a new precinct captain, and actually turned over something like 2/3 of the precinct captains in 18 months. And focused the whole department not around its arrest statistics, but around figuring out where the crime problems were and getting the problems down. And it worked. Now, yes, crime went down even in Los Angeles, where the police department was grossly mismanaged at the time.
Precisely.
But it went down more and more steadily in New York, and once the crime started to go down, you can start to bring the arrest numbers down. And I think the key thing to fault Giuliani for is that once Bratton left, they just kept ratcheting the arrest numbers up when they didn't need to.
You mean once he pushed Bratton out?
Once he pushed Bratton out, yeah. But, Bratton came here and did the same stuff here, and if we could figure out something that's as good and as time-sensitive a measure as crime reports are for policing, for other parts of the public service, I would love to give every kid in school a laptop and have him do exercises on the laptop, that feeds into some central system. And I'd love to have the principal calling the third grade teacher and saying, "What's happening to Billy Smith's reading scores? He was doing well, but they plateaued 2 months ago. What's the problem? What are you doing to fix it?" And so I'd love to bring that technology to the rest of it. I think crime in particular is an easier problem to solve in principle than it looks, but it's a harder problem to manage your way out of than it looks. Somebody who did an experiment on drug use and the kind of thing we've been talking about, it took 2 years to negotiate actually getting the experiment done because the judges didn't want to do it, and about 2 months for the heroin users to reduce their heroin use once it was in place. And so Adele Harrell, who ran the experiment, said, "Well, what we've learned from this is that changing addict behavior is easy, but changing judge behavior is hard." And
so then,
so yes, I think we can get a lot better, but it requires a lot of complicated blocking and tackling. And we need to have people, and you're right, it needs a reformulation of the question of crime as a political question, from how should we get revenge on these evil people to how should we manage this problem. If you start talking about crime, well, we talk about traffic or air pollution, we're halfway to the solution.
Okay.
And, and the fact that we've had a big crime decrease makes it easier. I mean, crime's not the kind of public issue now it was 20 years ago. Nobody's running for president on crime this year.
Thank God.
Thank God. We might even get to the point where you and I, instead of saying thank God for that, as we both do now, we'll say the other thing you could reasonably say, which is, why is this central issue of particular concern to poor people and racial minorities being neglected? Right now we say, look, thank God nobody's talking about it, because if they were, they'd be saying something stupid. But it ought to be a key progressive issue, that we're not delivering this basic public service of public safety to people who most desperately need it.
Well, but it's more complicated than that, isn't it? I mean, aren't these people who would be made more safe in the most dangerous parts of our cities also the relatives and friends of people who are going to be incarcerated if we ratchet up the punishment regime as you would like to do? And aren't there feelings of ambivalence and, really complex reactions to the legitimacy of the exercise of state authority in these communities which are generally neglected, stigmatized, and held in ill repute in the venues of power in the society?
That's right, and that's the reason yes. And that's the reason that the police forces that are doing this job best have figured out that they need to do community organizing. And talk to David Kennedy about the way they did High Point, North Carolina. They organized the community. They made direct threats to the people who were dealing drugs. That was their big problem.
I heard the story. Call them all in and tell them,
Tell them we got you.
We know who you are, and we're going to deal with you.
Well, no, not only we know you are. We have you on videotape. So if you don't stop dealing right this minute, you're going to prison. And they talked to the community and said, look, we don't want to send these guys to prison, and you don't want them in prison, but you also don't want them dealing drugs on your doorstep. They got the community support. They issued the warning. They offered social service support. And not many people went to prison, and the market disappeared. In fact, many fewer people went to prison than would have in the course of routine drug law enforcement.
Wouldn't decriminalization of drugs go a long way toward taking a lot of the sting out of this problem in these cities?
Yes. I don't think there's any doubt. Well, decriminalization is usually used just to mean not arresting people for possession. I think if you leave it a criminal market, then eliminating user arrest doesn't get you very far. If you mean would we have less crime in those neighborhoods if cocaine were a legal drug that you bought at the liquor store, I think the answer is probably yes.
Heavily regulated, of course. I mean,
well, the way liquor is. I mean, the problem is that heavily regulated seems to me misses the political economy of vice, which is that once you have an industry that sells an addictive substance, the industry is entirely focused on creating addicts because they're the customers, right? I mean, the alcohol industry, 80% of the alcohol sold in this country is sold to people who drink too much. And so I think the prospects of maintaining tight regulation.
I'm not following your logic, Mark, because nevertheless, that regime is better than the prohibition on the sale of alcohol regime.
I doubt it.
Most historians agree. You don't?
I doubt it. I mean, certainly not better from a crime point of view. I mean,
you think prohibition was a good thing?
Well, no. I think prohibition was a bad thing for two reasons. One, we couldn't, in fact, enforce it. Never tried to enforce it the way we're now enforcing drug prohibition. The other thing is there were big lost consumer surpluses, right? People wanted to drink, and most people who drink don't take any harm from it, just the way most people who use other drugs don't take any harm from it. And so if you add all that up and consider the fact that we were trying to overturn a very basic cultural pattern, prohibition was a loser. But just on the crime side, I'm not convinced. Yes, you had people doing drive-by shootings in Chicago with submachine guns rather than AK-47s.
You're the expert here, man. But when I looked at the statistics, I saw a murder rate in the United States in 1930 that was huge relative to the historical precedent. I mean, it was virtually at the level of the murder rate in the 60s and 70s, no?
Not quite that high, but it was certainly high.
It was real high, and it was peaking, right? I mean...
Yeah, though, I mean, the Depression had something to do with that. No, I don't think it was all prohibition. I think there were lots of social changes in the 20s. The thing is, back in the 20s, we didn't measure domestic violence. Right? I mean, it's not as if having legalized alcohol...
I see. That's a good point.
I mean, we got something like 2/3 of the homicide in the U.S. Either the victim or the perpetrator or both are drunk. So my view about alcohol is, we got rid of prohibition. Are you having fun yet? And remember, if cocaine were legal...
The answer is, yep.
If cocaine were legal, we'd have a bigger alcohol problem, not a smaller alcohol problem, because they're complements. And alcohol and cocaine together are ferociously violent. So, yes, we could choose to have a public health problem rather than a crime problem by getting rid of drug prohibition. But I'm not sure we'd enjoy it. And I think we can...
I really remain to be convinced about that. I mean, that the increase in drug abuse that would be associated with legalization would... be quite so great that it would outweigh social benefits from holding these hundreds of thousands of people that we hold behind bars for engaging in mutually consenting transactions between adults.
Now, there's two things to say about that. One is, remember, my view is we could do prohibition a lot more intelligently and not have all those people in prison. Right? Because if we take away their best customers by making sure the probation and police don't use, then we don't have to go out and arrest a bunch of dealers. So partly I'm comparing not the current regime to legalization, but a better prohibition regime to legalization. But the other thing to say is, in the neighborhoods we're talking about, I think you're mostly right. Right? I think most of the benefits of drug prohibition are in non-burned-out neighborhoods.
Where, I'm sorry? Most of the benefits from drug prohibition
are in middle-class neighborhoods, where the people don't have access to those drugs and therefore are less at risk of using them and aren't currently paying this enormous price in terms of having drug markets in their neighborhood. So, yes, if all you cared about was the welfare of the worst off, then drug legalization looked like a pretty good idea, I think. But it seems to me the cost everywhere else would be pretty high. Remember, at any one time we've got about 2 million cocaine addicts in the U.S. But it's 2 million people who are abusively using cocaine. Not all of them are addicted. Pardon me. At the same time, we've got about 15 million people who were abusing alcohol in a pretty serious way. So there's a lot of room for growth. Because I don't think that difference is just because alcohol is more fun. It's not, the last time I heard. Or more addictive. It's not that either.
But because it's legal.
And heavily promoted. I mean, commercial legalization of a vice is a really dangerous thing. And I wish I could believe.
Well, you could. You could
do it. You could have a state store system.
You could restrict advertising. You could have state stores. I mean, whatever.
You could try, but notice how badly that's broken down in the alcohol case. Again, it's the political economy I'm somewhat worried about. But the other thing to say about this is, I mean, now we're really having a utopian conversation. I don't think there's. I mean, it
ain't gonna happen, is what you're saying.
We could legalize cannabis, and my view is on cannabis, which people grow their own, but that wouldn't much fix the crime problem. But no, I don't think.
It would make a lot of people happy, though.
It would, and I'm for it. And save some enforcement resources. But there are things we could do about drug policy that would reduce the number of people in prison and the extent of drug abuse and drug-related crime. Legalization isn't one of them because there's not public support for it. And if we acknowledge that from the point of view of the majority of the population it's a loser, then it's not as if we could talk them out of that. So I think the legalization debate is mostly a distraction from doing the real work of fixing our drug policies. Anyway, that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
Okay, well, to be continued. We're at the end of the hour.
Yes,
here.
Indeed.
Why don't we sign off? And unfortunately, we haven't had enough to disagree about, but I'm going to work on that so that the next time we talk, we can argue vociferously.
Excellent. Thanks, Glenn.
Nice talking to you.
Take care.